Good morning. Welcome to this episode of Ask Pastor Tim. I normally put out these episodes on Friday, but yesterday, Friday, was the very first meeting of the clergy session of the Iowa Annual Conference online. It was kind of a historic event for us to gather online to make decisions about ordination and new persons entering ministry and the questions that all surround those kinds of things. And I thought it went pretty well. And so we're learning to function online as a conference. So we're going to share today in a question about that came to me from one of the members of our congregation about the meaning of Sabbath. Is the Sabbath Saturday? Is the Sabbath Sunday? What actually is the Sabbath? And what do we mean by that, and how does that relate to our Christian faith? Well, to begin with, one of the things we need to recognize is the concept of the Sabbath comes out of the Jewish tradition that's found in the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians often call the Old Testament, but is really more properly referred to as the Hebrew Scriptures. And if you remember in Genesis and in the Torah, God sets aside one day a week, the Sabbath, in order for God's people to both have opportunity to focus in that day on worshiping God, and also to get a Sabbath's rest, a day's rest from their labors. And so this was created by God as a blessing in the life of God's people. An opportunity to focus on God, to focus on also caring for themselves. And that day is the sixth day. The Sabbath is actually Saturday. Although in the Jewish calendar, one of the things that confuses Christians sometimes is that in the original Jewish calendar and the days of the week, the day starts at sundown and goes through sundown, what we would call the next day. So sundown Friday is when the Sabbath begins, and the Sabbath ends on Sunday, down on Saturday. So what about Sunday? What does Sunday have to do with worship, and why do Christians worship on Sunday? Well, Sunday is Resurrection Day. It was called by the early church the Lord's Day. And so Christians, as they began to gather in the early church, as the early church was forming, began to worship Jesus on the day of resurrection. Some Christians for quite some time continued also to attend the synagogue because they had grown up in the Jewish faith, were Jewish Christians, and the fact that the two experiences of worship were on different days helped them to maintain that opportunity. But also as the church became more Gentile, as the gospel spread throughout the world, Sunday then became the main focus for Christian worship. And so technically, Sunday is the Lord's Day and not the Sabbath. Now, Christians have incorporated some concepts from the Sabbath into the Lord's Day, and that we have often encouraged people to use Sunday as both a day to worship and also as a day of rest, a day of caring for our relationships with each other, with family, as well as our relationship with God. What's different about that than the way our friends in the Jewish faith observe the Sabbath is that the church has over the years taken a different approach to faith. As we look at the letters of Paul, we look at the teachings of Jesus, and rather than keeping the Sabbath by having a certain number of requirements, expectations, rules that we are to follow about the Sabbath, the church has chosen to focus on the larger picture of God's grace in all that we do, and focusing on the picture of that grace as being displayed to us in Jesus' great commandment to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, or all your heart, soul, and spirit, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said that within those two things, love God and love neighbor, encapsulates all the meaning of the law. And so for me also, the broader question of Sabbath and Lord's Day reminds us as Christians that while we greatly respect the Jewish faith and are thankful for the Jewish faith, we operate a little differently as Christians. When we read the Hebrew Scriptures, we do not follow all of the Old Testament laws that are there. For example, we don't follow the kosher laws. If you look at what happened in the early church decided early in its inception that it was not necessary for Christians to follow those laws. Many Christians were Gentiles who had never followed kosher, and so that's not an expectation of Christianity that we follow Jewish dietary laws. Many of the other purity laws that are found in the Hebrew Scriptures are directly related to the people of Israel, the Jewish people, and so the church, Christians do not necessarily follow those. Instead, we follow what the Apostle Paul would have called the law of grace. And so we have to be careful then as Christians when we read back in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, that we don't misapply or apply kind of on an ad hoc basis the Hebrew Scriptures to our Christian circumstances. So, for example, one of the arguments that often comes up when churches like ours who are reconciling congregations talk about wanting to provide marriage for both opposite sex and same-sex couples is that, well, doesn't the Jewish law say something about, or doesn't the Holiness Code say something about homosexuality? And it does to some extent, but it's in a section of the text that's full of all kinds of rules that the church doesn't follow. And so one of the questions that you have to ask yourself is, how can you cherry pick things out of the Old Testament, say I'm going to follow this or not follow that? And if you're just doing it based on whim or personal preference, that's not good theology. You can't really just skip through the Bible and pick what you want to follow. Instead, Christians are expected to follow Jesus' interpretation of the law and the early church's interpretation of the law, which is that we are under this larger umbrella of God's grace and love for us all, and that we have to recognize that as we learn new things, as we grow, as our world changes, that we apply those in different ways. It's why United Methodists use what we call the Wesleyan quadrilateral, that our faith and our doctrines are built from the understanding of Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, not just Scripture alone. There are some denominations who will claim that they follow Scripture alone. They call that sola scriptura. United Methodist would say that we follow what we probably would call prima scriptura, Scripture first, but Scripture can't be understood without interpreting it. And those who hold to an idea of Scripture alone, though they probably would argue with me about this, really don't just follow Scripture alone. They still follow the traditions of their denomination. They still have interpretations of Scripture that are based on their own history and their own denomination's views. So I think it's more straightforward to just say and understand that to understand Scripture, books of the Bible, 66 books that were written in Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew in a different culture and a different time, have to be interpreted well and carefully and faithfully to be fully applicable here in our world today. There are a lot of issues that we deal with in the Scriptures that are affected by what's going on in the world today. And people have used and misused the Bible to say lots of different things. You will be hearing tomorrow from me in worship in my Sunday morning sermon, and I'm going to talk about the sin of racism in my Sunday morning worship sermon. And there are people who have used the Bible during the Civil War period and before to try to defend slavery from the Scriptures. And you can do that by taking certain passages where Paul does not condemn slavery, but we see the Bible and its overall message as being a message of love and grace that today would cause us to condemn ideas of racism and bigotry in all their different forms. So while the faith is very simple, As Methodists like to say, do no harm, do good, love God. Sometimes the application of that faith is hard work. It's complicated. It requires us to pray a lot and learn a lot and stretch ourselves and seek to be gracious, loving, godly people. To me, the important thing about Sabbath, the Lord's Day, is not that we try to create some group of rules for ourselves. I've known persons who, growing up, would not do any yard work on Sunday, or would not do anything other than go to church services. If a person wants to do that, that's fine, but there's no prescription in the New Testament that says if you enjoy gardening, you can't garden on Sunday, or if you enjoy going out for a walk after worship, that you can't do that. That's just not the way that we utilize our understanding of Sabbath. Jesus said at one point that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so we encourage people to worship God on the Lord's Day. We encourage people to take care of themselves and take a break and take Sabbath time to relax, to rest, to be with family. But as we do that, we try to be gracious with that and open with that. I'm also thankful to our Jewish roots and our Jewish community and our Jewish friends who share with us in their Sabbath celebrations, which also allow them to do the same kind of things in a different way. And I've been blessed to learn from their example of their love of God and the Sabbath as well. May God bless you on this Saturday, the Sabbath day for our Jewish friends. And I hope to see you tomorrow in worship on the Lord's Day, virtually, as we share together through Facebook Live, through YouTube, and also on our church website following the service. And if there's any way that I can be of service to you, please let me know. Again, keep the questions coming for Ask Pastor Tim. As long as people have questions, I'll continue this video presentation opportunity each week. Send emails to me at pastortim@indfumc.org, or contact me on Facebook if you would like, Facebook Messenger. Feel free to drop me a text if you've got my cell number. But I love to hear your questions and have opportunities for further discussion. May God continue to bless you over this weekend, and we'll look forward to being in worship together tomorrow.